Did you know that on D-Day, around 15,000 to 20,000 troops either died or were wounded? D-Day was a huge turning point during World War II, which helped the Allies out with a lot of events that would come in the future. Winning over Normandy gave the Allies a foothold in Europe from where they could then expand on. This eventually made the Germans retreat until they surrendered. In 1943, a few years before D-Day had taken place, a meeting was held between the Prime Minister of Britain, Winston Churchill, and the United States President, Franklin D. Roosevelt, and a few others. They were discussing whether or not they should try to invade France. At first, they agreed that attacking Europe was too risky, and it would just get them involved with the whole mess going on in Germany. Eventually, the Allies realized that even though that it was a bad war to get involved with, they would need to do it to stop the Nazis from gaining too much power. Germany was invading many countries, and the Holocaust was also going on. The Allies realized that Germany could be a really big threat, and Adolf Hitler was a really dangerous man. The Allies decided that they would invade an area in France called Normandy the following year. The codename for this invasion would come to be known as Operation Overlord, and General Dwight D. Eisenhower was put in charge. Normandy was a great town to have the invasion take place in. The Germans were definitely not expecting Normandy to be the place where the invasion would happen. In a way, General Penn had fooled the Germans into thinking that the invasion was going to take place in another town in France, going under the name Operation Quicksilver. That was a really smart move. He had set up fake tanks in other towns in France, and that made the Germans think that something was going to go down there. Many German men were stationed in other areas in France, but not Normandy. General Eisenhower planned to have the real invasion take place on June 5, 1944, but because of poor weather conditions, they rescheduled the invasion so that it would now take place the day after, on June 6, 1944. The plan was to have a few planes and aircraft drop the Allies onto the beaches of Normandy, and a bunch of ships would then follow them in afterwards. Operation Overlord called for over 150,000 men the first day. There were 5 beaches on Normandy. There was Gold Beach, Juno Beach, Sword Beach, Utah Beach, and Omaha Beach. The British would invade on Gold Beach and Sword Beach, and the Canadians took Juno. The Americans took Utah and Omaha Beach. Finally, the invasion took place during the early hours in the morning. The Americans were able to easily defeat the Germans and secure Utah Beach. Gold Beach and Sword were a bit harder to secure than Utah, but eventually they were able to take over those beaches as well. The Canadians had difficulty invading Juno, and they suffered many casualties, but eventually they also took over Juno Beach. Omaha was the trickiest beach to invade, and the biggest beach of all too. It was also covered in cliffs, so an attack would be very difficult. The Germans had built barricades around Omaha, and there were trenches with men surrounding the beach also. Tanks were supposed to arrive to help the Allies out as well, but they didn't show up, so that just made matters worse. The American troops were heavily exposed, but the Germans didn't shoot until the first line of men arrived on the beach. Once the Allies had arrived on the beach, the Germans massacred them. After 6 hours, it seemed like there was no chance of victory, but suddenly an Allied battleship arrived on shore and started to attack the Germans. And this did give the Allies a bit of help. The Americans realized that the only way they would get out of this mess would be if they escaped over the cliffs of Omaha Beach. The Americans climbed over those cliffs, and they were finally safe. Hitler had controlled all of Western Europe until that very point when the Allies took hold of Normandy, France. Although the Allies now had control over Normandy, France, that wasn't enough. They needed to force Germany to retreat until they surrendered. They would also need to expand their army and improve it to make it stronger. In order to fight the tough German army, they would need to train before attempting to defeat them because of the reason that Germany was so powerful. The American government asked citizens to cut back on use of metals and other materials that could possibly be made into weapons. They needed to get as many weapons as they could. American troops were also shipped into England, and from there the US soldiers and the British soldiers would go through training. Towards the end of this training, they would come up with a plan that would help them expand off that foothold that they had in Normandy, France. The main goal was to force Germany to retreat until they were all the way back in their home country.
They would start by invading the rest of France. The first thing they did after D-Day was invade and take over the French fort of Cherbourg, and the Germans start to retreat a bit. They then moved to a bigger target, which was Paris. The Allies helped liberate Paris after it was under control of Germany for 4 years. Next, the Battle of the Bulge happens on the Western Front, and the Germans still have a bit of hope. They successfully pushed the Allies back 50 miles, and then they ran into the Allied defenses and dug themselves into a hole. They ended up losing the Battle of the Bulge. At that point, Germans were running low on supplies, and their only choice would be to retreat back into Germany. Now the Allies were on the Western Front, and the Soviet forces were coming in on the Eastern Front. Hitler realized that the Germans had lost and that he would be captured. He definitely did not want to be captured by the Allied forces, so instead he just killed himself, and the war with Germany was over. General Dwight D. Eisenhower accepted the German surrender in France later that month. At the beginning of the war, Germany had full control over Western Europe, but the Allies invaded Normandy, France, and got a good foothold from where they could then expand on. The Battle of Normandy was a little bit tricky to win, but the Allies pulled through with success. Now that they had control over the town in Western Europe, they trained for the tough weeks that were to come. Once they started the invasion, their goal was to make Germany retreat until they surrendered. In conclusion, I was correct by saying that D-Day was a turning point in the war. Do you think that we would be where we are now? Or would the war have ended the same if we hadn't been successful on D-Day?